Right now, as you watch this, the United States is pumping a record 13.5 million barrels of oil every single day. We are the energy kings of the world. So why, as of March 2026, are gas prices in Los Angeles hitting $8.21 a gallon, while the rest of the country averages $3.47? It's because 5 specific states have been turned into energy islands, physically severed from American pipelines and legally trapped by a century-old law. With the Strait of Hormuz effectively closed this week, the Refinery Gap has just become a reality. Today, we're looking at why California, New York, Washington, Massachusetts, and Michigan are days away from a total systemic blackout, and why the massive U.S. oil surplus cannot save them. State number 1, California. In 2026, California stands behind a lead curtain of energy isolation, a geographic paradox where the world's 5th largest economy functions as a literal energy island. Despite being part of a nation currently producing a record-breaking 13.5 million barrels of oil per day, California remains physically severed from the U.S. pipeline network. This structural disconnect forces the Golden State to source over 50% of its crude from foreign tankers traversing the volatile Strait of Hormuz, while the Permian Basin in Texas overflows with supply. California's energy security is tethered to geopolitical stability 7,000 miles away. If a maritime blockade occurs, the state's massive refinery complex, representing nearly 10% of total U.S. capacity, faces an immediate catastrophic halt. State number 2, New York. The state is currently sleepwalking into a 2026 energy catastrophe, trapped behind a self-imposed pipeline blockade that defies both geography and economic logic. Despite bordering the Marcellus Shale, one of the world's most prolific natural gas reservoirs in Pennsylvania, New York's regulatory environment has systematically strangled the infrastructure needed to transport it. By blocking the $1 billion Constitution Pipeline and the Northeast Supply Enhancement Project, the state has severed its connection to cheap domestic energy. In early 2026, this infrastructure deficit became a crisis. While the national Henry Hub price sat at $3 per MMBTU, New York City spot prices skyrocketed to over $12, a staggering 300% basis risk premium paid by residents simply because the gas cannot travel the final 100 miles by pipe. The danger peaks during the winter pivot. Without sufficient pipeline capacity, New York City is forced to compete on the global stage for liquefied natural gas, LNG shipments, often sourcing fuel from the Middle East or even Russia, to keep its heating systems from failing. In 2026, this strategy has turned lethal. With the recent closure of the Strait of Hormuz disrupting 19% of the world's LNG supply, the just-in-time ships New York relies on are being diverted to higher bidders in Europe and Asia. The NYISO's short-term assessment of reliability warns that NYC's reliability margins are now dangerously thin, a fact punctuated by the emergency orders issued during Winter Storm Fern to prevent a total grid collapse. As legacy baseload plants retire and AI-driven electrical demand surges, New York's refusal to build pipelines has transformed the Empire State into a fragile energy island. The state is no longer just fighting for green energy. It is fighting for the basic ability to keep the lights on when the next deep freeze hits. But it's not just about pipes and ships. The 2026 reliability chasm is being ripped open by the AI revolution. Data centers are now consuming power at a rate equivalent to 55 million households, hitting the grid exactly as we retire the legacy coal plants that provided our mechanical inertia. We are tearing down the old engine before the new one is even built. State number 3. Washington State sits at the terminal end of a Pacific cul-de-sac, a geographic reality that has transformed the evergreen state into one of America's most precarious energy frontiers in 2026. While the state prides itself on its hydroelectric dominance, its transportation and heating sectors remain tethered to a fragile maritime lifeline. Washington's 5 major refineries, clustered primarily in the Puget Sound, process over 630,000 barrels of crude oil per day, yet the state produces zero oil of its own. Instead, it relies on a single-straw supply chain, the Trans Mountain Pipeline from Canada, and tankers arriving from Alaska and the Middle East. By 2026, The Trans Mountain expansion has reached its absolute nameplate capacity of 890,000 barrels per day, leaving no margin for error. Any seismic event in British Columbia or a diplomatic rift with Ottawa creates an immediate supply choke that the Pacific Northwest simply cannot bypass. The vulnerability is magnified by the Jones Act constraints, which make it prohibitively expensive to move domestic oil from the Gulf Coast to the port of Anacortes. Consequently, Washington remains hyperdependent on the just-in-time maritime arrivals that navigate the increasingly congested Salish Sea. In 2026, as global shipping insurance premiums spike due to Pacific Rim tensions, the cost of securing a single Aframax tanker has surged by 40%, a cost passed directly to consumer at the pump and through the grid. Furthermore, Washington's aggressive transition toward the Climate Commitment Act has accelerated the retirement of backup fossil fuel peaking plants, creating a reliability gap during peak winter loads. If a maritime blockade or a pipeline rupture occurs during a 2026 Arctic blast, the state's reserve margins, currently hovering at a razor-thin 15%, will evaporate. Washington isn't just transitioning to green energy. It is navigating a high-wire act where one snap cable plunges the entire Pacific Northwest into a cold, dark forest. State number 4, Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, the 106-year-old Jones Act prohibits foreign flag vessels from transporting cargo between U.S. ports, a rule that has effectively severed the state from the Gulf Coast's record natural gas surplus. Because there are zero Jones Act-compliant LNG tankers in existence, Massachusetts is legally barred from buying American gas. Instead, the state must compete with Europe and Asia for international shipments at the Everett Marine Terminal, which provides critical pressure support for the entire region. In early 2026, as global LNG prices surged by 300% due to overseas conflicts, Massachusetts residents saw their heating bills double, a direct consequence of being tethered to global volatility rather than domestic abunda. NC, state number 5, Michigan. Further west, Michigan faces an internal existential threat centered on Line 5, a 645-mile pipeline crossing the Straits of Mackinac. While federal courts recently reaffirmed that Michigan cannot unilaterally shut down the line, the ongoing legal siege has stalled the Great Lakes Tunnel project, leaving the state's energy heart vulnerable. Michigan is the nation's top consumer of residential propane, and Line 5 is the primary artery supplying 65% of the Upper Peninsula's heating needs. A single disruption, whether from a legal injunction or a maritime strike, would cause an immediate shortage of 750,000 gallons of propane per day, leaving 320,000 households without heat during a 2026 Arctic blast. For both states, the 2026 cliff is not about a lack of resources, but a lack of infrastructure resilience. Massachusetts is a maritime hostage to international pricing, while Michigan remains a pipeline prisoner to its own geography. Without a shift toward energy realism, these front lines will be the first to fracture when the national grid reaches its breaking point. The 2026 conflict scenario, the 2026 Middle East trigger, is no longer a tabletop exercise for analysts. It has become the catalyst for a global energy decoupling that strikes the American coastal energy islands with surgical precision. As localized skirmishes between Israel, the U.S., and Iran escalate into a sustained maritime blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, the primary artery for 21 million barrels of oil per day, roughly 21% of global consumption, is effectively severed. The immediate impact is a violent decoupling of Brent crude from domestic WTI prices, with global benchmarks skyrocketing to $150 per barrel overnight. For states like California and Washington, the insurance freeze is the silent killer. Maritime insurers have declared the Pacific and Atlantic shipping lanes high-risk zones, causing premiums for tankers to surge by 1,200%. This financial wall prevents just-in-time shipments of the specific heavy sour crude these coastal refineries require. While the American interior remains insulated by a $75 Permian surplus, the coastal margins are forced into immediate, tiered energy rationing, as their foreign lifelines vanish behind a wall of geopolitical fire and prohibitive logistics costs. The tragedy of 2026 is that the transition to a green grid has reached its most vulnerable stage, the reliability chasm. While the United States has successfully integrated over 250 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity, the physical bridge to a 100% renewable future remains unfinished. The core issue is mechanical inertia. Traditional coal and gas-fired plants provide the heavy, rotating mass necessary to maintain a constant 60 Hz frequency across the grid. Without this baseload, the system becomes hypersensitive to even minor fluctuations. In 2026, the gap between the retirement of legacy plants and the deployment of long-duration utility-scale storage, like iron-air or flow batteries, is at its absolute widest. Current lithium-ion installations only provide 4 hours of backup, yet 2026 weather patterns are demanding 72-hour resiliency. We are essentially tearing down the old house before the roof is on the new one, leaving the energy islands to face a 30% baseload deficit that renewables simply cannot fill during a maritime fuel embargo. The resulting total blackout is not merely an inconvenience. It is a systemic mechanical failure of modern civilization. In this 2026 fallout, the loss of electricity triggers a cascading utility collapse that starts at the water tap. Most municipal water systems rely on electric pumps to maintain pressure. Without power, boil water notices become irrelevant because the taps run dry within 12 hours. The digital tether also snaps, as cellular towers, equipped with only 4 to 8 hours of lead-acid battery backup, go silent, plunging entire metropolitan regions into an information vacuum. The most devastating blow, however, hits the diesel heart of the supply chain. Because coastal refineries cannot process domestic light crude, they stop producing the ULSD, ultra-low sulfur diesel, required for heavy trucking. Within 48 hours, grocery distribution centers freeze. The just-in-time economy, which functions on a 3-day inventory cycle, grinds to a halt. This is a 2026 reality. A geopolitical spark in the Middle East, amplified by a chemical refinery gap and a premature grid transition, creates a silent, dark, and hungry energy island where the lights don't just flicker, they stay off. How to exit the island? Exiting the energy island requires a shift from passive consumption to active energy resilience as the 2026 grid vulnerabilities move from theoretical risks to tangible threats. For residents in coastal regions, true preparedness begins with diversifying fuel sources to bypass the maritime refinery gap. Investing in dual-fuel generators is a critical first step. While gasoline degrades within 6 months and relies on a fragile retail supply chain, propane boasts an indefinite shelf life and remains accessible even when local refineries stall. Data from a 2025 winter hardship reports indicates that households with localized propane storage maintain 40% higher survivability rates during multi-day outages. Beyond personal hardware, understanding local microgrid options, such as community solar paired with iron flow long-duration storage, can bridge the 48-hour gap where standard lithium-ion batteries typically fail. These decentralized systems provide a lifeboat for essential services, maintaining water pressure and basic connectivity, even when the high-voltage national transmission lines are forced into load-shedding mode due to the Middle East supply choke. However, individual prep is only half the battle. The long-term solution lies in an aggressive advocacy for energy realism. This involves demanding a balanced bridge infrastructure that pairs aggressive renewable growth with the physical pipeline connectivity needed to transport Texas's $75 per barrel surplus to the energy-starved coasts. Without this bidirectional flow, states like California and New York remain prisoners of global volatility, paying a maritime premium that is 300% higher than the national average. Voters must push for the reversal of natural gas bans that have left 15 million coastal homes without a backup heating source during 2020 in excess projected Arctic blasts. The current 15% reliability margin is a statistical warning. We cannot legislate away the laws of physics or the reality of chemical refining mismatches. The conclusion of the 2026 energy story is a choice between fragility and fortitude. For over a decade, the American public has been told that energy independence could be achieved by simply disconnecting from the global and domestic supply chain. But the reality is that energy security is national security. We have spent years pretending we could survive on an isolated island without consequences. But in 2026, the systemic bill for that isolation finally comes due. When the Strait of Hormuz closes and the local Refinery Gap halts production, the only question that remains is, will you be a victim of the island or will you be ready when the lights go out?